So a group of prominent UK women have signed an open letter to tell all of the far-right bigots that they need to stop linking immigration to sexual abuse. They're arguing that there is no link whatsoever between immigration and sexual assaults and rapes, and we've all just got our facts muddled up. I've got the brilliant Rafe Heydel-Mankoo, the historian from the New Culture Forum, to talk to me about it. But first of all, let's just take a look at some of the contents of this letter. It's being proudly paraded around by The Guardian. Let's take a look at some of the snippets they've got in their article. We reject the far right's racist lies about protecting women and girls. They are not defenders of women. They exploit violence against women to fuel hate and division, the letter says. The letter, which has been coordinated by Stand Up to Racism, surprise, surprise, also says violence against women and girls is a serious and urgent issue, but it will never be solved by the likes of Nigel Farage and Robert Jenrick targeting refugees, Muslims and migrants. There's no evidence that people seeking refuge are more likely to commit acts of sexual violence. Many of themselves survivors of violence, war and persecution. Blaming them distracts from tackling the deep-rooted causes of abuse and from holding those truly responsible to account. The letter accuses the evil far right of seizing on lies and spreading misinformation to mobilise protests outside hotels housing refugees, including women and children, in a move which the letter says does nothing to make women safer. And I have to say, Rafe, I'm just shocked reading this and feel like they've got their head in the sand when they say there's no evidence whatsoever, because just to give you one example of the many studies from, we've had studies from not just at the UK, but in Germany, Italy, other places, putting certain nationalities, which are very prominent in the numbers coming across on boats, as being far more likely to commit crimes. And it's not just sexual assaults, it seems to be across the board. Hope you're enjoying this video so far. Most of you watching this, however, are not actually subscribed to this channel, so hit the subscribe button down below and the notification bell so that you can stay in the loop when we're posting new videos. So this is just some of the data from the Centre for Migration Control. So the conviction rate in England and Wales by nationality per 10,000 people. You can see on each section the number of people who are, just normal Brits. There's this tiny little red bar at the bottom. I mean, if we look at sexual assaults, you can see it's 6 per 10,000 people if you're from the UK, but 59 if you're from Afghanistan. And then, if you look at theft and you look at violence, it is even worse. And maybe they're right. Maybe we've got our stats muddled up and they're not quite perfect. Maybe this isn't 100% accurate, but even if it's just the case that the likelihood of an Afghan sexually assaulting someone is twice as likely rather than 22 times as likely as some stats have shown, shouldn't we still be concerned, Rafe?
Well, look, firstly, let me just say, this is an utterly disgusting open letter that's been made. You ask whether these people have their heads in the sand. You have to ask, are they dim or are they being disingenuous? Because we have the stats, as you've just shown, and there are many more charts, much more evidence. This is not a debate. This is not a debate between different opinions. We have the evidence, and tellingly, they haven't supplied any evidence to the contrary to back up what they're saying. But, whenever I'm wondering about the true depth of crime in this country and what the stats really say, the first person I go to is Paloma Faith. And then I wonder what Charlotte Church's research has been into this, because obviously they are two leading experts. If these two women signed this letter, they have no idea. I don't know. The politicians on this who have signed this letter, they're smart enough. We know that Diane Abbott has to take her shoes and socks off to count to 20, but I'm sure even she
can't even put a right and a left shoe on her feet or open a gate.
But she can at least see a picture of a graph. We know, rape has quadrupled in this country in the last 10 years. And it's in the last 10 years, of course, that Europe has experienced the mass migration crisis, starting in 2015 when Angela Merkel invited in 1 million Syrian refugees. Is there a link? Perhaps is it a coincidence that rape has quadrupled over the same 10 years that we've had mass immigration from the third world? I'll leave your viewers to draw their own conclusions about that. But it's deeply offensive also and upsetting, I would say, to all the women who've been victims of migrant sex crimes. And it's outrageous for people like, these ladies to demonize those of us who simply seek to raise awareness about what is obviously one of the greatest issues of our time. Let's call this out for what it is. This is an attempt to silence the truth tellers. And there's a certain coterie, a certain type of liberal, left-leaning, middle-class woman who are filled with privilege, who inevitably lives in areas completely unaffected by third world migration, who have a visceral hatred, it seems, for the British people, and are very willing to throw British women under the bus for the sake of being beholden to this cult-like ideology of multiculturalism. They're so petrified by political correctness, and indeed in many cases saving their own seats, which are based upon the Muslim vote. I speak here about people like Jess Phillips.
Definitely.
Jess Phillips is the Minister for Safeguarding Women. She is the Minister of the Crown charged with the defence of women, yet not once does she ever criticise the rampant misogyny, the violence against women, and the sexual aggression coming from particularly within the Muslim community, in part, I suppose, because she knows that her constituency, her seat in Parliament, depends upon placating those. So here we have someone who is prioritising personal politics and party politics over the safety of women when she's charged to do that. This comes at the same time as we've had another tweet that was put out and deleted this in the last couple of days by Kat Eccles, a Labour MP woman, who said that degenerate native men are the biggest threat to women. Now, just let that sink in. How much hatred must you have for the British people to use the term degenerate when referring to the indigenous population? And clearly, when the evidence shows just the contrary, you've shown those charts. Afghanis are 22 times more likely to commit sexual offence than a native Brit is likely to do that. And this is something you can experience across Europe. Denmark and Sweden, they officially publish the data about migrant crime. We don't do that officially in this country, and you must wonder why. Is it because they're deliberately trying to suppress the truth from the British public? But the Danish evidence is just the same as you cited about the British evidence. We know Eritreans, Somalis, Syrians, Pakistanis, people from the Middle East. We know precisely which countries cause the most amount of sexual assault and other types of crime. And coincidentally, those are the nations that form the bulk of the refugees we are, the alleged asylum seekers, let's call them economic migrants or economic scouts, that we are willingly allowing into this country. It's complete madness, but we need to call out these types of women. They're actually the biggest threat to Britain after mass immigration, because they seem to have no idea of what it's like living cheek to cheek with the dark side of diversity. And what happened to the Me Too movement? What happened to believing women for what they said? You know, all of that goes out of the window when it's dealing with people of color. Suddenly, women's rights, women are not to be believed by these left-wing feminists.
Yes, the hypocrisy is off the scale. Now, there are a couple of arguments that I see them coming up with very often. First of all, they say, the biggest issue when it comes to trying to reduce the number of rapes and sexual assaults in this country is the fact that the vast majority of rapes and sexual assaults just go unsolved by the police. The other argument they make is that even though, well, they're not really willing to admit it, but even though some groups are more likely to commit rapes and sexual assaults, it's still the case that the vast majority are committed by white Brits, so we need not worry too much about immigration. What would you say to those two arguments?
Well, the first one has no bearing upon the argument at all. The second one, I would be, the fact it's something you often hear about in terms of the rape gangs as well. Look, Britain is still vastly majority white. I think 75% of the country is still white. So mathematically, yes, of course, if you're looking at simple, pure numbers, probably there are more rapes committed by white men than by ethnic minorities. But that's not how you do statistics. You look at per capita. And if you look at per capita, as I've just said, the chances of getting a sexual assault of an Afghani is 22 times higher. If you look in Paris, for example, 77% of sexual assault convictions in Paris are by foreign nationals. And actually, I haven't seen the latest data, but I am beginning to wonder whether actually, if we did look at the total number of rapes in this country, whether white British actually would be hugely underrepresented according to their population. Because we were getting to a point actually in the 1990s and early 2000s where violent crime, sexual crime, all of these things were decreasing rapidly. Homicides were going down. And they would be even lower now were it not for mass immigration. So we were seeing a decline in rape, we were seeing a decline in violence, we were seeing a decline in homicides, partly also because people stopped drinking as much. People aren't, and a lot of violence and crime and sexual assault is alcohol driven, and people aren't going to the pubs as much as they used to. So actually, if it wasn't for mass immigration, we would have the most remarkable stats on crime and basically how low they are at a historic low.
Yes, we could be living in a very safe society if we hadn't had mass migration.
Yeah, exactly. What really gets me here, of course, is that this is a repeat of the grooming gang scandal. You would have thought these people would have learned what happens when you try to cover up the truth. We had decades of people like Diane Abbott and Zarah Sultana and so forth denying and calling anyone who pointed out what was happening in the Rotherham and Rochdale and elsewhere as being far right and racist, and they're up to the same tactics once again. Well, the British people aren't buying it. They won't have it any longer. You've cried wolf. They can see what's being happened, and they can see when they're being gaslit. And look, it's no coincidence that in the last 5 years, we've suddenly seen on London Underground signs going up warning people against sexual harassment, against sexual staring, against sexual pressing. Now, that's happened at the same time as London's white population is declining and its ethnic minority population is increasing. Suddenly, there's a need for those signs. Again, is that a coincidence?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, even when you're not at the point of something being a rape or a serious sexual assault, there are very different customs, I would say, in our country versus other countries on things like staring. So, for example, when I was in the Middle East last year and I was in Syria and Lebanon, one thing I noticed is that the men would stare at us, not just a little look and check you out, like menacingly stare at you. I'm not saying every guy did this, but it seemed really common. And at first I thought, oh, maybe they're just looking at us because we've got cameras out and we look a bit different. But then it became very clear that of all of us that were there, it was the the young pretty ladies that they were just menacingly staring at. Is a different culture.